Fraudulent 60-win teams. When a team wins over 60 games, you could safely say that they're in contention for the championship. So when they surprisingly lose to a team that they should have beaten, not just lose but lose badly, it raises some questions. Were they actually as good as their record indicated? Or were they simply built for the regular season, not the playoffs? Let's take a detailed look. How's it going, folks? My name's Andy, and in this video, I want to take a look at 6 of the most fraudulent 60-win teams in NBA history. But before we continue, I want to introduce you to the sponsor of this video, Rocket Money. So what exactly is Rocket Money? So a couple years back when I was renovating my kitchen area here, I needed to save up to make a big purchase. And it was actually really helpful, especially if you're like a compulsive spender like me. It's a personal finance app that helps you build a custom budget to save more money and achieve that financial freedom you're looking for. Check this out, my favorite feature is you can use Rocket Money to negotiate and lower your bills for you. They can negotiate anything from internet bills to phone bills. You could also cancel unwanted subscriptions safely and securely within the app itself with just a few clicks. So you don't need to worry about calling different companies or going on their websites manually, because it gets annoying after a while. If you want an easier, more streamlined way to manage your finances, go to rocketmoney.com/andyhoops to get started for free, or you can click the link in my description below. The 2021-22 Phoenix Suns. In the previous year, the Suns surprisingly shocked everybody and made it all the way to the NBA Finals. However, one caveat was every team they beat was missing either their best or second best player. Then, after going up 2-0 against the Bucks, they lost 4 straight, as the championship slipped out of their fingers. So fast forward to the 2021-22 season, the Phoenix Suns managed to win an astounding 64 games. This was their best record in the history of their franchise. Better than any regular season that Nash and Stoudemire ever had. Better than anything in the Charles Barkley or Kevin Johnson era. However, there were still some doubts in the back of our minds. When the Suns reached the finals the previous year, going through all of those injured teams, the question became, are they actually this good when facing a team at full strength? Can they make it back to the finals once again? Not only did the Suns get blown out at home, but their 30-point halftime deficit was the largest in the history of Game 7s. There's no Game 7 in history that had a blowout as bad as this one. And funny enough, this happened again in Game 6 a year later. Another 30-point halftime deficit, this time to the Denver Nuggets. Basically, everything that could have went wrong, went wrong. DeAndre Ayton completely vanished. Jay Crowder barely hit any wide-open shots. Devin Booker lives and dies by the mid-range. This time, he died. Chris Paul looked like he aged 5 years overnight. He turned 37 on May 6th. Prior to turning 37, he was averaging nearly 23 points a game in the playoffs. After he turned 37, he averaged 9 points a game, and turned the ball over like crazy. And he's normally very good at taking care of the ball. Same with Booker, they both had several high turnover games, which ultimately cost them the series. They had a game where they combined to turn the ball over 12 times, another game where they combined for 13 turnovers. Even though Dallas increased their full court pressure and their length disrupted them, many of their turnovers were caused by a complete lack of awareness and lazy play. As the lead ballooned to 46, this wasn't even the worst blowout Chris Paul has been a part of. Back in the 2009 playoffs, Paul's Hornets lost to the Denver Nuggets by nearly 60 points, at home. You could point to the Mavs aggressively trapping Paul and Booker to force them to get rid of the ball, but this Suns team was just mentally weak, with a roster of players who just didn't want it bad enough, and crumbled under pressure. The 2010-11 Spurs. It's very unlikely we see a number 1 seed choke in the first round. It's even less likely to see it happen to a well-coached team like the San Antonio Spurs. As the 2011 playoffs began, the Spurs had a lot to prove. In the previous couple years, they saw the Lakers regain their championship status with 3 straight finals appearances, while the Spurs were struggling to get back there. It made us wonder, can they still do it? Is their dynasty over? After a dominant 61-win season, people were still hesitant to call them a true contender. For one, Tim Duncan just had the worst season of his career. They were going through a transition period, as their main core was slowing down, but Kawhi has yet to arrive. Not to mention, the Spurs slowed down drastically as the year went by. After the All-Star break, their record was only 15-11. Everyone likes to point out Ginobili's elbow injury, but he only missed one game, and he still led the Spurs in scoring. This new upcoming Grizzlies team featured a bruising front court, a top 10 defense, both of which gave the Spurs a ton of trouble. Despite the Spurs having the league's number 2 ranked offense, the Grizzlies were equipped with arguably the NBA's best defensive backcourt, Mike Conley and Tony Allen. But it was their big men that gave the Spurs more than they could handle. They were straight up bullying them. Duncan looked like an old man, and he was basically their only big man, unless you count Antonio Spurs, who was 36 years old and retired a few months later. They simply could not handle them in the paint. Some say, oh, this was simply a matchup nightmare for the Spurs, and they would have fared better against any other team. However, because they had such a huge weakness in the front court, they would have most likely lost to the Lakers or Mavs regardless. Despite the Spurs' record, this was one of their weaker teams of this era. The 2019-20 Milwaukee Bucks. Technically, the Bucks did not win 60 games this year, but they were on pace to do so. They went 56-17 in the pandemic-shortened season, which is the same win percentage as going 63-19, so I feel like they fit in the theme of this video. In the second round of the playoffs, they lost to Miami. It wasn't just a regular loss either, it was an absolute trouncing. The Heat won the first 3 games, and over the course of the series, it was quite clear from the get-go that Milwaukee was the inferior team. There were several problems with this version of the Bucks team. One, they severely lacked any decent playmaking. They lost Malcolm Brogdon in the previous offseason because the Bucks ownership was too cheap to keep him. This is what Bucks co-owner Mark Lasry said about this. Quote, "Our view was that Malcolm is a phenomenal player, but for that amount of money, we thought we could have those dollars better spent elsewhere, and we'll find out." Well, they sure as hell did find out. With Eric Bledsoe doing his usual disappearing act, and Giannis getting suffocated every time he steps foot into the paint, the Bucks had to rely on Chris Middleton to be their primary playmaker. They surely could have used Brogdon's three-point shooting as well. 2. The Heat defended the Bucks to perfection. Bam Adebayo was, and still is, the most underrated defender in the entire NBA. And surrounded by solid wing defenders to deal with Middleton, none of their role players stepped up. The Bucks' over-reliance on Giannis came back to bite them. And 3, most importantly, the Bucks had a lack of toughness they needed to address, and this loss to Miami forced them to retool their roster. They acquired guys like Drew Holiday, Bobby Portis, and PJ Tucker to add a new level of toughness they've never had before. Oh, it paid off big time. The 1993-94 Seattle Supersonics. The Seattle Supersonics were one of the most dominant teams of the 1990s, a team defined by their balanced offensive attack, and an incredible defensive backcourt that even Michael Jordan admitted was the toughest team he'd ever faced. In this season, however, Jordan was absent, as he briefly retired to play baseball. Naturally, this opened up the entire league. Several teams were now in the running to win a title. But who is the next team up? Well, the Seattle Supersonics were young, they were ready, they were ambitious. And after a dominant regular season, they became the favorites to win the championship. Then, this happened.
That's it. Mutombo embraces the ball, and the unlikely upset, one of the great upsets in NBA playoff history, the 8th seed.
The lowly 8th-seeded Nuggets won 3 straight games to knock him out. This was the first time in NBA history an 8th seed defeated the 1 seed. The driving force was none other than Dikembe Mutombo. The Nuggets were a great defensive team with him at center, and he completely nullified the entire Sonics front court. Shawn Kemp, who was the team's second-best player, was held to fewer than 15 points a game on horrendous shooting. Mutombo averaged 6.2 blocks per game. Since the NBA started recording blocks, That's the highest blocks per game average of any playoff series ever. For the Sonics, it was a disappointing end to an otherwise fantastic season, and unfortunately, a year later, they got knocked out in the first round again, after winning 57 games. With 1994 and 1995 being the best years they had to win a title, the Sonics missed their chance, because soon Jordan came back to squash their only shot to win the title. The 2014-15 Atlanta Hawks. Is it valid to say that a team that reached the conference finals was a fraudulent team? In this case, I think it's valid. Unlike most teams on this list, nobody expected this Hawks roster to win 60 games to begin with. They didn't have a single player average over 17 points a game, and some journalists even called them the Spurs of the East. Their offense was reliant on ball movement, a lot of passing, less dribbles, and a lot of high-quality shots. Equipped with a roster of players including their bigs who could shoot, dribble, and pass, it was a system that worked. Mike Budenholzer was an assistant coach on the Spurs for 17 years after all. In fact, only the Golden State Warriors averaged more assists per game than the Hawks this year. Except there was one thing missing. Despite having 4 players make the All-Star team, which ties an NBA record by the way, their lack of a true superstar came back to bite them. Despite their regular season dominance, they certainly did not look that way in the first 2 rounds of the playoffs. Even when they won, you could tell their offense was getting stifled. There were stretches where they couldn't score at all. There was nobody you could throw the ball to and reliably create a play out of thin air. They needed to operate within their system to score. It also didn't help that the NYPD broke Thabo Sefolosha's leg, forcing him to miss the entire playoffs. He was their best perimeter defender. In the conference finals, they got dismantled and swept by a Cavs team that didn't even need Kyrie. When you think of a team that was solely built for the long grind of the regular season, this 2015 Hawks roster is the perfect example. They were deep, they were talented, and they played within an unselfish system where any player could fit in and contribute. But at the end of the day, that's all they were, a great regular season team. And finally, at number 1, the 2006-7 Dallas Mavericks. Few teams in history have reached 67 wins. For the Mavs, this was supposed to be their greatest year in NBA history. They were an established franchise who've been contending for a long time, but now they finally broke through. They were ready to bounce back after a shocking defeat in the finals, and this season they were determined to get revenge. Preseason odds had them as the favorites to win the championship, and they shattered their expected record. On the other end, this was the Golden State Warriors' first playoff appearance since 1994. The We Believe era gave the franchise hope. They sported a group of guys who were seen as misfits and outcasts. But one thing they had in common was they had a chip on their shoulder. They were determined to prove their critics wrong. Coming into this series, the Warriors were 3-0 against the Mavs in the regular season. Still, for a team as great as the Mavs, you gotta expect them to make adjustments, right? It looks like they needed more than that. Unlike the slow-footed, slow-paced, methodical Mavericks, who dominated with their half-court sets and their calculated approach on offense, the Warriors were the complete opposite. They played with a relentless amount of energy, running and gunning, first in the entire NBA in pace. Not surprising for a team coached by Don Nelson. Oh, that's another thing. Don Nelson coached Dirk Nowitzki for the first 7 years of his career. He knew his game inside and out. Back in 2007, Dirk struggled a lot against smaller defenders. The guys who were 6'7", 6'8", athletic with quick hands disrupted him greatly. His post-game wasn't very polished yet either. The Warriors were a small team, but they also had the quintessential players to counter Dirk. The Mavs had the advantage in size, but their bigs did not score much in the paint. They were 25th in the league with just 35 points a game in the paint, so the size difference didn't matter as much. Dirk had by far the worst playoff series of his entire career. You combine that with the Mavs' inability to keep up with the faster Warriors, it was the perfect storm for the Warriors to take the series. However, the loss wasn't the most embarrassing part, it was what happened afterwards. So, the NBA used to announce the winner of the MVP in the second or third round of the playoffs, usually in the middle of the arena. They had to do a separate press conference. So Dirk accepted the trophy shortly after they got sent home. It was the most depressing, unceremonious MVP announcement I've ever seen. The Warriors got easily handled in the second round by the Utah Jazz. It was just a horrendous matchup for the Mavs, and it makes you wonder, if they didn't play the Warriors, how far could they have gone? They matched up super well against every other contender in the league, so maybe it's too harsh to call them frauds, just because of one bad matchup. What do you think? Anyway, that's all folks. Those were 6 of the most fraudulent 60+ win teams in NBA history. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Which other teams do you think should have made the list? Do you disagree and think some of them weren't frauds, and simply had bad matchups that got exploited? Thank you all so much for watching, I hope y'all enjoyed the video, and of course, as always, I'll see you next time. Peace.